Welcome back to Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan. And in our next episode, I was joined by Tom Lord. Tom is an experienced C-suite executive in the commodity and carbon market space. And of the many things he's doing right now, he is serving on the board of directors for a company called Dcarboniz. They're a trade group that promotes decarbonization through the use of carbon intensity and methane intensity as an attribute for the underlying commodity trading, particularly focused on the gas markets. Tom and I do a deep dive on how these markets will need to evolve in order to use these kind of attributes, including the importance of data and standards, how risk transfer is managed between buyers and sellers, and how regulation will factor into the ongoing market development. If you enjoy the episode, please make sure you like, and to stay on top of all upcoming episodes, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Tom. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our next episode of Navigating Carbon. And today I'm joined by Tom Lord from Dcarboniz. Tom, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, Deb?
I'm doing really, really well. I'm so glad that you're here today so that we can talk about all things markets and commodity markets, but how decarbonization and carbon intensity and methane intensity fits into that. So really excited to dive in. Can you explain, as we get started, who Dcarboniz is for everybody listening?
Okay. So Dcarboniz is a 501c6. So it's a nonprofit trade group, just like many of the other trade groups, organized by a group of folks who really were looking at the nat gas market and methane intensity, carbon intensity, the new carbon intensity indices that were coming out, and talking about how is the market going to ingest this information. And part of the problem is that currently the alignment of how people around the world are doing methane intensity and carbon intensity and incorporating into the market have a bunch of different paths. And the concern is, how do we create a structure where methane and carbon intensity becomes a part of the market in a way that is an efficient risk transfer from the sell side to the buy side? So we have focused very much on being a group that brings in buy side, mid-market, both from the trading and from the transmission side, and then upstream. But
Very cool.
we're focusing is we're not focusing on how to build standards. We're not in like how to build measurement standards or things like that. What we're focusing on is how do we build business rules where the buyers and the sellers can create a fungible set of products as opposed to one-on-one bespoke products that they can then trade and make it easier for everyone to transact while creating the ability for the buy side to recover the premium they would pay for lower carbon intensity, lower methane intensity, and create the opportunity for the sellers to monetize their efforts to do this. Because currently what we have is a structure, a market structure, where people avoid methane releases and sort of go, how do I evidence this? And how do I monetize it? We're getting things like certificates. But if you go, for example, to Europe, buying natural gas and then reattaching a certificate has no value. Buying the gas is what you're doing. The certificates don't register to them. And it really comes back into how do we create a market that the U.S. suppliers can connect with not just their own buy side, which is the LDCs or the commercials, who still have the problem of how do I recover it? Because, certificates aren't necessarily recognized by public utility commissions. But then also, how do I sell to what is the marginal market for the U.S., which is LNG to Europe, LNG to Asia? How do I compete in those markets? So our mission is, how do we create a set of market rules, not a set of validation or verification rules, but a set of market rules that say, I need this data, this information to come with the gas that is in a manner that's acceptable for the market rules that my regulators have. Or in the US, a set of data such that when I go to the Public Utility Commission in state X, Y, or Z, they recognize that I bought a product that they can understand has a greater value in achieving their renewable portfolio standards or their green standards or whatever they want to do. That's the mission, is creating that infrastructure, and both from a market rules and a data infrastructure. What goes along with it, right? That's the simplest way to describe it.
Which is awesome. There's so much there to unpack. You talked about risk. You've obviously talked about the market rules. We've talked about transferring like that kind of risk and stuff like that from buy to sell. One of the things I want to start with though is the focus on natural gas instead of crude. And I know you and I have talked about this before a little bit, but like, why is it that you guys are focusing on gas and you think that that's going to really be the commodity other than crude that's going to be the way forward, or the one that kind of leads the way, if that makes sense?
Again, part of what's happening is you're already seeing efforts in the US, elsewhere, to create methane avoidance. I mean, methane is a hugely influential, if you would, product in climate change. It's got a multiple of carbon dioxide as far as its impact on climate change. So people are going and making efforts to avoid methane. Methane releases errant emissions. So there's already an investment here. Easiest way for that investment is to then be acknowledged into the remaining methane that somebody's selling. You don't really have that same sort of correlation over to the crude side. Also, you're looking at the European markets. The EU now is putting in rules associated with the methane intensity of LNG. So we're already in that world.
Yep.
So we're creating a set of market drivers, not necessarily market rules, but market drivers for monetizing this. So to us, it makes sense. Plus, you're now getting into the gaseous markets. Hydrogen's going to get there. It's going to be another carbon intensity in this same thing. If we can create the ecosystem, the market ecosystem for gaseous fuels that creates this methane intensity, it has the ability to ingest any number of different paths in a way that crude really is self-defining.
Yeah.
So that,
and I think one of the things you and I've also talked about is that these gas markets are going to have to compete with power and on that kind of business to business side, whereas crude in the use in fuel in cars and stuff like that, it's not the fuel, it's the actual car that's being penalized and some of that kind of stuff. Whereas it's, so thinking about that product versus the actual how it's being used is sort of the other piece about it.
And the buyers in this market, in the nat gas markets, in the gaseous fuels market, tend to be the regulated entities, right? My car is not regulated, but I've got a situation where if I'm buying as an LDC, which they all are, I've now got a set of rules I have to get to my regulator to recover costs. So I need a structure that this all flows through. Again, as you said, risk transfer, risk transfer gives me a mechanism for creating an interface between what the suppliers are doing and what my regulator wants me to do. Because they're standing in the middle more than the buyer in a car is. So it makes sense for us to think in, okay, where you said crude and gas. One of the things that also, in a very different way, crude in a way already has a market mechanism that replicates what could be done in gas. Crude as a market has very different qualities. So you talk about the quality of crude when you sell it. In the US market, once gas goes in the pipeline, it's all considered the same. I have no quality basis. I have location basis, but no quality basis. The real problem, in essence, that the US market is trying to address in the gas market is you now have a different quality between different streams of gas, but we'd have no mechanism for pricing it. So the question becomes, can you, in a lot of ways, chief risk officers I know who come out of the refined products when we're talking to them about decarbonize. And I say,
Yeah.
why can't we set up methane intensity as a quality item that you're trading different quality on? And they all go, of course. And you talk to a natural gas buyer and they go, what do you mean different quality? And so this really can be potentially a way where you all of a sudden start re-ingesting market rules from different markets. It's one of the ways you
and
get.
like taking those lessons learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's another place that
That
eventually.
idea, and the idea that methane intensity and carbon intensity is going to be an attribute, like it would be in crude with API and other things, that it's
As
easily
opposed,
priced off, like you said.
it becomes a
Yeah.
physical attribute as opposed to a certificate attribute. That becomes the question of how the rules go. Yeah.
Yeah. Could
Okay.
have really big difference. So yeah.
So anyway,
Very
continue.
cool. So let's stick with that risk kind of conversation for a sec, because I know you and I've talked about this a lot, and this idea of sort of transferring the risk from the buyers to the sellers and vice versa, and some of that kind of stuff. So why is that so important for the market, so that we can actually see some of these transactions and the value of carbon intensity really start to materialize?
Because been at this a while, watched everything deregulate from crude. And the problem is, in the beginning, the market starts normally with the sellers saying, here's what I have to sell. And they say, here's what I want to sell. And the buyers go, that's really nice, but it's not what I want to buy. I mean, I'll give you the example that I think is that many people in this market will recognize. Power deregulated in the late 90s. The generator said, I want to sell you 5x16 power. And everybody went, that's really nice. I can buy 20% of my supply on that. After that, 5x16 power creates as much risk as I had before I bought anything, because now I've got the wings. So the question here becomes, when people say, I'm going to sell you natural gas, and then I'm going to give you a bunch of certificates on top of it. The buyer is saying, well, if I pay you extra for that, I now have the risk, A, that my regulator won't accept them, so I can't recover the cost. Or B, I've now bought them and somebody sues us for greenwashing. So part of the question becomes, what is the market mechanism that the buyers can say, I'm willing to buy and pay you for lower carbon intensity in a manner that when I buy that, I have managed all the risks, including the carbon. And what we're hearing from the buy side is the current market of a bifurcated physical and environmental attribute market causes them risk issues. And so the question we're trying to explore with the buyers and the sellers is, what is a set of market rules and a set of market data that when the buyer gets it, what they have to pass on either to their commercial customers, right? Their commercial customers may say, I want to know the carbon intensity for my scope 1 emissions. What I'm going to disclose, I have to have that information, but your certificates aren't good enough for me to use, or they are, or my regulator won't let me recover it. So it becomes that question of, what is that data and what is that information, and how must it be associated with the gas, such that the buy side says, I don't have to go to the producer and do a bespoke product. I can buy something in the secondary market where I know all the data will come along to me in a way that I can utilize and get rid of all of these risks, not just the risk of not having enough nat gas.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And like, one of the things that I think will be interesting as we see this, you talked about how you guys at Dcarboniz, you're not generating standards, you're not doing any of that verification and stuff like that. But the idea of being agnostic to standards in this, do you think we're going to start to see either some standards become the norm because that's what people are used to seeing, or that we'll end up with different, like, how do you think that might evolve with like this idea of like being agnostic around standards, so that nobody's picking a winner, but like, I don't know, how do you sort of see that evolution?
Well, I think you're going to end up, and sort of the way personally, and I mean, one of the things with Decarbonize is I'm also a member of the Committee of Chief Risk Officers. We're structuring ourselves really similar to that, where the members, when we finally got a full slate, we have people on who are joining our board, major international firms that are joining our board to become the members leading this more than the folks who've really started it.
That's cool.
It's going to be when those buy and sell side people to sit together and say, here's what we're willing to do. That will drive in a lot of ways what we have going on. So that is going to be the process for getting to what data we need. Once you get to what data you need, you can then move forward to what standards meet those data needs. And that will keep from picking winners and losers. It's what methodologies will get the data that the market needs to be able to flow along. So that's sort of where we see ourselves going.
Okay, so one of the other things that you and I have talked about a lot, and the challenge around coming up with the right data. So you've just talked a lot about having and understanding what that data is between the buyers and the sellers. The challenge around accounting of physical inventory versus the actual carbon accounting of it. Can you talk about some of the challenges that you're seeing as you guys are having these buy-sell side conversations?
Yeah. So the carbon accounting, so let's not talk about physical versus carbon. Let's talk about market versus inventory accounting. So market accounting would be, I've got this gas, I bring it to you, I then have a separate market for certificates, I reattach them, and now I create that. Whereas many of the markets, for example, in Europe, they only want inventory accounting, which is what is the physical attribute of that gas that comes along, and how can you evidence that you have not removed the environmental attributes to go off? So part of where we see the potential for this market, and I don't know which will win, but having literally two side-by-side standards, which say, if I'm going to trade on market accounting, my gas will go here, I will have certificates, they'll match up, and here's how we will have a trail of all that information. Versus you may have an inventory accounting, which says, I've got this gas, I will evidence how I have avoided this methane, and then I will have evidence that I have not sold any of those physical attributes. And I am basically accounting for the methane in the physical, not in a separate market. I think there are going to be buyers who want that second market to be the way they want to go. There are going to be suppliers that go this way. And I think it's going to be a question of who will meet in a manner that you create a fungible market, that they're willing to say, not only will we do it this way in bespoke, but we will let you trade through so that it comes from 2 or 3 people in the middle. That's going to be, I think, the question of how that inventory of market versus inventory accounting will go. So,
Tom, you alluded a little bit right back in your opening with Dcarboniz's mission about regulation and the importance of that. You're obviously a lawyer by background, and so you're very good about going through and reading all these regulations and understanding the nuance and the bits and pieces around that. But really, which regulations do you think are going to be really critical, and how do you think they're going to start shaping the market?
Well, so I think you've got 3 sets of regulations that are going to be critical here. And I think they may go in very divergent directions. The first one was, or is, the U.S. natural gas methane regulations that have been adopted by the EPA. We don't know where those will be going and what will happen to them. So let's just take an assumption that they go away. And so people are saying, why are we caring about this? I think that's an easy way. That's an easy place to start. If the U.S. market continues with the EPA regs, okay, I got to meet these to be there. Real easy. That sort of fit, that gets everybody started. But let's assume they go away. The EU has adopted market regs associated with methane intensity, and they cover imported LNG, such that going forward in a relatively short period of time, so not 50 years, but not one, U.S. gas will come to the border and they will be asked, what is your methane intensity? That methane intensity will not be allowed, currently as written, to include certificates. It's going to be, what is your physical inventory methane intensity? And the way I've heard it described pretty easily, and it's a term that is being adopted in the U.S. gas markets, is the concept of rock to dock, which is from the bottom of the wellbore to the flange into the LNG tanker. How do you follow that? Because once it gets into the tanker, that's pretty easy to do. In the U.S., that's a non-trivial process. We have backhauls, we have any number of things. Yeah. The thing that people need to recognize is if that has to happen, our competitors in the LNG markets have a much simpler way to do this. Places like Qatar, places like Australia are just lined up saying, I've got brand new facilities, I've got one pipe, I can give you all that data. And if the EU starts imposing fines on this, it means that the US loses that marginal market, which is not good for US gas producers. No. Not worrying about the buyers, but the producers are losing their high price market. It's not a good thing for them. So part of this from the decarbonized side is, how do we make sure that we're creating a market space that US suppliers can continue to sell into in a market structure that, if they're going to have to do that, how do they get the US customers to pay them the same premiums for high carbon, for low carbon intensity? Why don't we set up a market that everybody's willing to pay for? So those regulations, and then obviously as Europe starts taking even more and more into stationary commercial buildings for their emissions trading systems, you now again have people having to pay for that carbon intensity when they burn it. Obviously, the more you can reduce it, the more the customer not only sees that as a reduction in cost, it actually reduces their exposure to risk in the emissions trading markets. So you can sell it across as any number of risk control mechanisms. So it makes sense for people to attempt to understand what are the regulations on their buyers. Once again, that's why we have the buy side there. And it is, how do we create a market structure that incentivizes the sell side to sell people what they need to manage their risk? Back to the beginning.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good framing of that, because just because people are producing gas here in the US, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's guaranteed that it's going to end up through LNG to Europe if they don't have some of this stuff figured out.
Or is it going to be that when you show up at the European border, you get hit with a fine, which means they're going to pay you less, which means the US suppliers are less competitive, or they just have to accept lower prices than everybody else does. Don't want to get there.
No, I don't think any of the producers here do. So, and particularly the IEA put out their new outlook right at the end of last year. And if you believe it, we're heading to a bit of a gas LNG glut. And so you want to be competitive in that space.
You want to make it
so it's going to be really interesting.
You want to make it as easy. Think about it. What does it take for someone? I think it wasn't it Chevron, MIQ, and Uniper did a big deal.
Yes, I think it's them.
What did it take them to put together a bespoke deal of that level, where you had to go through all of this stuff and basically create the structure for the deal? And I'm not sure anybody really knows where that will stand under those regulations. Wouldn't it be better if anybody can just sell into it in a fungible manner?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to mean that, business rules. There's less risk then. Exactly. Yes. So before we wrap up, I'm really curious then, as you're looking out in sort of the broader market and stuff like that, like what do you think is coming? Where do you think this is going? What challenges do you think we still need to resolve? Like, what's your kind of outlook?
Well, I mean, the challenge is, and in a way, sometimes they're challenges to decarbonize. I mean, Ukraine, Russia, yesterday or 2 days ago, that really puts pressure on people as to whether or not you're really going to follow the green path. Or do you say, look, we just need the gas. We're just going to buy whatever we can.
Yeah.
So I think they're going to be
And for
pressure.
those not familiar, like gas is
Okay.
going to no longer go from Russia through Ukraine into Europe. So
Right.
it's just
Which
adding
is
to that
much,
supply side
much
struggle.
of,
Yeah.
and much of the gas that goes to Europe from Russia goes through Ukraine. The
Goes that way,
significant majority. So again, now all of a sudden they're short gas. Does that mean they relax the rules? Those sorts of, so that market, renewables versus nat gas, again, the more you get penetration, the more you need nat gas on the peak, but the less you need it the rest of the time. So again, I think there's going to be this continuing dynamic of what does the natural gas market start to look more like the power market with peaking needs and less like a baseload market? How does this get impacted? And then, the last one I really do think is, does the rest of the world, Asia, et cetera, adopt methane intensity? I will tell you that I was at New York Climate Week 2 years ago, and I had investors in LNG facilities in Asia, because when I was talking to people about this, saying, how can I buy low methane intensity LNG into my facility in Asia? I think Asia is going to start adopting these type of rules, which again becomes, how does the U.S. address them? So those are the type of places,
I would agree with that one.
the scenarios I see coming.
Very cool. I think the Asian one's a big one. I think Japan's probably going to lead the way on that. They've put guidelines in place.
It was Southeast Asia. It was not Japan that those questions were coming from. You're going to see Vietnam, Cambodia. I think you're going to see Vietnam especially be a leader in this space, which is
very cool.
One of the versions.
Not often a country here in this space.
No, but they're going to. I think they are seeing themselves as a place where they can supply across. There's so much of the outsourced manufacturing from China now. They have
that makes sense.
needs, and they're really looking at LNG.
Very cool. Makes sense. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your thoughts today. We've covered a lot, and it's really cool to hear. I always love talking to you about these things. So I appreciate you joining us from Northern England.
Anybody who wants to reach out, there are a number of us at Decarbonize. You reach out. I'm on LinkedIn. Send me a note, and if you want to hear more about it.
Brilliant. I'll make sure I include all that in the show notes as well. So
thank you.
Really great. Thanks, Tom.